we recognize, and our president and CEO, Mark Morial, recognized that we need to be really pushing for equity and justice and democracy day in and day out. It's a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week job. And so I'm just really excited to be part of this important legacy and to also take a lot of the momentum and advocacy that we saw in 2020 and years preceding it, and really pushing to make sure that we see some more meaningful reform. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Jerika. Really appreciate it. And now, Andre, some of your thoughts and why you came to this and a little bit about ManUp.
Sure. Good evening, all. Thank you again to those that invited us to be a part of this program. My name is Andre T. Mitchell. I'm the founder and the executive director for a community-based organization here in Brooklyn, again, Bob, called ManUp Incorporated. We are a 16-year-old street-based organization that was founded after the unfortunate shooting and homicide of an 8-year-old boy out here in East New York. From that day on, we've actually, from our volunteer efforts, mobilized the community, organized after-school programs, summer camp, and all sorts of year-round activities for the entire community. We became a community and family justice organization. The way that we really operate right now is on the first line. I don't say the front, I say the first line, where we are literally at the core of a lot of the things that are happening in our neighborhoods. And our work is to mostly interrupt the violence and to be able to redirect it and change behavior norms. And so we've been doing that now for, like I said, close to 2 decades now. And we're really looking at how we can reimagine what public safety looks like. We're in a good example. We have some great results that we have experienced, and we're looking forward to sharing all that we know.
Thank you so much. The nation stood in shock and just deep sorrow at the murder of George Floyd almost a year ago. Jerika, from a national perspective, during our first kickoff of this series, Long Road to Justice, we were brought into virtually into the EJI, the Equal Justice Institute, founded by Brian Stevenson, where we were educated and enlightened on the role that systemic racism has played in policing in America. What do you see today in the 21st century, the role of systemic racism in policing and public safety?
Well, I see in this century that systemic racism still plays an extremely large role. And I think when we're even talking about systemic racism, it's important to, unpack that. Race is a social construct, and racism is really the othering of other individuals or suspicion about other individuals that are different or come from a different racial group than oneself. And I think what we saw in 2020 with the death of George Floyd, and quite frankly, Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and so many others, is that this racism permeates our system. It's clear within the criminal legal system, but it's also clear in housing and education and a whole host of areas. And it colors oftentimes the way we even see one of these situations or incidents. Sometimes I think, quite frankly, there is the notion that in this country, we don't always see each other as human beings. And that has resulted in this negative treatment, inequitable treatment of people of color, more often than not, Black and brown people, but we've also seen it in other communities, in the Asian and Native American communities. So the George Floyd case, I think, really was an awakening for America. It really underscored for many people that may have not seeing these incidents over and over and over again. COVID-19 just kind of ripped the blindfold off, and it was the stark contrast between how one community is treated versus another was abundantly clear. And so I will say that while there are many that are happy about the outcome in the case or the trial of Derek Chauvin, I think it's one case. And so I still think it's important for us to underscore that we have an extremely long way to go in really ensuring accountability, but also justice. For me, what that means is not even getting to the situation where we have incident after incident and then hopefully an outcome where there is accountability. Justice is preventing those incidents to begin with. And there's a huge culture change that needs to happen in this country in order for us to get there.
I think that you put it really beautifully. Justice is preventing. I always joke around when I teach that I'm a disciple, literally a follower of our great teacher in America, Smokey the Bear, that taught us to prevent forest fires rather than having to put them out. And Smokey really had a deep impact on me, both Smokies, Smokey Robinson and Smokey the Bear. But Andre, let's bring it down right into East New York. How do you see systemic racism playing out in East New York? I mean, like I said, I'm totally Brooklyn, born in Canarsie, lived in Brooklyn up until a few years ago. And I always kid around that I had to take a 12-step program when I moved to the Bronx. So tell me about how it plays out in the streets of East New York.
Well, it plays out every single day. I mean, as you know, like we are an epicenter and unfortunately the bedrock of a lot of the ills of racism and discrimination. You know, our neighborhood is the furthest neighborhood in Brooklyn before you get to Queens. And so it appears like we always are the last to receive any of the goods that are to come into the community, and that shouldn't be. But the way that things happen here on a day-to-day basis is it's unfortunate that it's different in other parts of the city and across the country and wider neighborhoods and community. The police, they have an understanding through the training that they receive that it is okay to stereotype and really racially profile our especially young boys of color, and approach them in manners where they literally their rights are violated. So the things that what we've seen happen with the incident of George Floyd was something that we have already been all too familiar with. And unfortunately, thankfully, someone videotaped that and it was posted and the world was able to see something that, again, many neighborhoods of color throughout this nation, especially East New York, was all too familiar. So yeah, like others, I mean, for us, it's the tale of two cities, you know, and we really we get the worst end of the stick. You know, we have the notorious 75th precinct out here. And, you know, there's a documentary out there that depicts a lot of how they policed, and we're working really hard, a lot of the leadership that's on the ground, like now in our community, to push back on that and to make sure that the police respects the people out here, and give them the respect that they deserve. And so, but we're still far from, away from where we need be. We still have a lot of incidences, a lot of complaints are filed out here. We one of the largest, we filed the most civilian complaints that any other precinct has reported in the city. And, it's just unfortunate. It really shows you the evidence of the divide between community and police. And unfortunately, it doesn't seem like it's going to get any better. And like it said, I mean, although we see there's been a conviction of this one incident, there are so many others that went unnoticed. Out here in East New York, we had the Kai Gurley, case. We think of the Eric Gardners and in our case, the Sean Bells. We have so many different countless cases where there's still been just so much injustice. And so hopefully, with what we see happening as a national response to what happened with George Floyd, we can, have some serious change and reforms, especially here in East New York.
Thank you, Andre. And we've been joined by now Lurie Daniel Favors, who's the Interim Executive Director for the Center for Law and Social Justice at Medgar, one of my favorite places in Brooklyn. And Lurie and I met each other a number of years ago over the census issue. Lurie, one of the things we asked initially, and if you can give us a little bit of insight, what brought you to the criminal justice reform table? What drives you and what drives the organization that you represent?
Thank you for that question and for having me as a participant in this panel. And just listening to what my co-panelists just said, I can tell it's already been an illuminating conversation. As it pertains to what brought me to this space, to the criminal justice space, and as it pertains to what anchors the Center for Law and Social Justice in this space, is a recognition that the policing we are experiencing today is really an outgrowth of policing as it was first constituted in this country. And that was as a body of people, typically white men, who were armed and deputized for the purposes of protecting what early Americans determined to be property. When they were speaking about property, there were really two definitions. One was the actual physical land upon which the early American colonists settled. And it was designed to, this group of police were designed to prevent indigenous Americans from taking back the land from which they had just been excommunicated. The second and more prevalent form of property protection was to ensure that runaway Africans, enslaved people who were fleeing the confines of enslavement, leaving plantations by the masses, doing everything they could to seek out safer land and safer territories, which often included collaborating and coalescing with indigenous Americans. White men who happened to have weapons, and that at that time was a significant number of them, were deputized to prevent the property from running away. The idea was that any white male or even a white female who had a weapon could be deputized and brought into the service of the then beginnings of what we now know as the federal, or at that point, municipal government, I guess would be the more appropriate way to say it. And they were really charged with maintaining this social project, which was a racialized hierarchy that determined who would have access to be considered a free person and who had access to be considered an enslaved person, which meant that even if you were technically a free Black person, by virtue of having Black skin, you were enslavable. And these were the parameters that really determined what policing in this country was going to look like. And we saw that even after the Civil War, when slavery had technically been done, when we won that war, the Black codes and other forms of legislation were implemented at the federal level and really at the state, city level to ensure that the state in which Black people found themselves was still criminalized, even though we were no longer dealing with a slave and master framework. So what that meant was, in the immediacy following the end of the Civil War, you have the implementation of what are called Black codes. Black codes were a type of law that were based on what had been known as the slave codes. And as you can imagine, the slave codes were this really intricate system of laws at the state and federal level that determined how Black people were to be treated in this society. And they were, regardless of their enslavement status, to always occupy the bottom rung of the hierarchy. So some of the Black codes included things like not having large groups of Black people gather together and whisper or talk quietly without a white person present. Being homeless or jobless. Why would being homeless and jobless be a crime? Well, because if you were homeless and jobless, you were considered a vagrant. And if you were a vagrant or you looked suspicious, you looked as if you didn't belong, you looked as if something might be wrong. And I'm using these terms intentionally because they are terms that we still hear today. Then you could be incarcerated for violating the Black codes, which again, laws only Black people could violate. Once you were incarcerated, the people who had previously owned you during the slave regime, even though slavery was now over, could come down to the local prison and rent you out the way that we rent out cars today, the way we rent houses today, and could literally take you home and force you to continue to labor for free for the duration of your incarceration. And that is when we see the birth of the prison industrial complex. So what brings me to this area is my passion for American history, which is a passion for the true history, sometimes derided as critical race theory, which has become quite the popular term these days. But it really is a recognition that what happened to African descendant people was to perpetuate a slaveocracy that would provide benefits to white Americans at the expense of Black people. And because that paradigm persists, that is what keeps us anchored and rooted in this space.
Thank you, Lurie. Jerika, to follow that up a little bit, you mentioned the dehumanization before. Seeing people that in communities of color as not quite human. How do you think that is playing out nationally? There are a number of folks out there that are trying to say, well, racism isn't really the cause of it. It's this reason or it's that reason. And black on black crime, which terminology I don't like to use, but I know it's used out there, is really the problem. How do you see this dehumanization playing out within the context of the American society?
Well, thank you for the question. One of the things I think that underscores how we see the dehumanization playing out is the fact that we are watching these videos of incidents involving people of color, more often than not, Black men, over and over and over again. And in some ways, I would say that sharing these videos is important in telling the story so that we can identify the problem and work together for a solution. But in the same token, these videos depict just a failure to see the people involved as human beings. If we're looking at Eric Garner, he's uttering over and over and over again, I can't breathe, I can't breathe. And he's surrounded by multiple officers, and the officer who is on top of him just continues to not even see this person as a human being, but something to be controlled, something to be subdued. I think if any of us, if we hear the term that someone can't breathe, I think the immediate reaction would be, how can I assist? We need to provide medical support. That was ignored. We saw it again with George Floyd. If we talk about the trial and just the testimony that we heard from the crowd, I mean, person after person, different races, I mean, young people, all of them caught in this really tricky scenario that really is the underpinnings of control and policing and race in this country, all pleading with law enforcement at the time, get off of him. He can't breathe. And the look that we saw, unfortunately, on Derek Chauvin's face, I mean, we saw how long that incident occurred, and it kept occurring. I mean, if we can't look at a situation like that and see how in this country people can look at another person who is different than them and treat them as if they are less than human, subhuman, then I mean, I don't know what else there is to say. I mean, if we look back at our history, which was outlined very well earlier today by Lurie, just thinking about African Americans, there was a 3/5ths compromise. Blacks were seen as 3/5ths of the person. It was determined that they were that. You know, the North really, in that compromise, they went from them be a Black person as being counted as one. The South was wanted to have control and be able to have more representation in government, but they did not want to. They did not want to be outnumbered. I mean, so the dehumanization of Black bodies is something that has just become part of the fabric of America. And the fact that we can continue to see these instances happen time and time again and have yet to see any real change in this country just makes it clear it's not just those that are involved in the act, but it's also on all of us in our inability to find a better way and to really create a better culture that includes people. And so if we continue watching and not acting, then it just reaffirms and reiterates this narrative of Black people and people of color not being seen as equal or human.
So thank you. By the way, if anyone has any questions, please put them in the chat. Some folks are reading them and they'll text them to me, and hopefully I'll be noticing of it and be able to follow up on your questions. Andre, now I grew up, as I mentioned, I grew up in Brooklyn. I grew up in the projects in Brooklyn, so maybe I'm not the best person to understand exactly how a community feels. But however, if I see a cop car rolling up on me, I get a little nervous, but I don't freak. How is it seen through the lens of folks walking around your community or in communities of color in general? How are the police perceived? Are they perceived as they're going to help me, they're going to hassle me, or something else?
Well, more the latter. The reality of it is the police is not well received in our neck of the woods. They are not seen as the public servants that, that's supposed to provide safety or courtesy or even respect. Unfortunately, they are perceived as the enemy. They are here, they are an occupying force. They are here to harass and to make life difficult. So unfortunately, the way that most people nowadays see the police in our communities, it's not like how it was once perceived as this heroic occupation that people once one day wanted to grow up to become. If you ask young people that are growing up in our communities today, they really have a dislike for the police because they see the police harassing and brutalizing, maybe their father or their neighbors. And so, and again, this is not necessarily all the police, but unfortunately, those that, that come in, the bad apples spoil the bunch. And so right now in our communities, the police, it's just a really widened divide. So there is no honest love for them to be here. We don't trust that they really mean really.
I think you're freezing a little bit there, Andre.
So I hope hopefully that better.
Yeah, you're good.
So there's this large disconnect. We cannot trust the police right now. We just can't. We have more evidence today than that's been made public than ever before. The other side of that is, communities are rising up, and they're organizing themselves, and they're becoming more and more aware as to how to push that type of treatment back and how to make sure that police are held accountable. So now more people in the community are on guard and on watch when they are stopped or when we see a stop in process. People are not as used to just walking by or driving by. Folks are pulling over today and they're pulling out their cell phones, and they want to make sure that that they are there to watch to make sure that everything goes well. I mean, that to me, I think is a good thing because we want the community to ultimately step up and the police itself. And I think that when those officers who are under the wrong mindset or thinking that they're going to get away with, maltreatment or harassment or even victimization or brutality, they're going to understand that it's not going to be easy to get away with it today. And I think that's a good thing. Community is definitely coming together. And that's something that we want to see demonstrated across the country.
So let me go a little deeper there, Andre. With the work that ManUp does and the work that violence disruptors do, obviously you have some connection to the local police or the cops. How does that work, and how do you navigate that tension in the community and the tension of the need to make it work for you and the people that you're protecting?
Well, as I said earlier, what we do out here is we serve as first line workers, right? We are like you said, the ones that are trained to know how to de-escalate, know how to mediate and interrupt incidences of violence. And so oftentimes we are there on the scene and we're interpreters. We know how to, intervene where we try to communicate to our community to let them know how to go about an incident and how to make sure that there's a positive outcome. We are using ourselves as those that are examples of knowing how to get the results that we want to see. All of these incidences don't have to end on the news. It doesn't have to end out violently. So we really want to try to get in before and get in between, excuse me, and see how we can be able to coach these situations back. We host a lot of opportunities like forums and conferences where people can really voice their displeasure. For the record, I'm also chair of the community board here. And so I often have the opportunity to call in my local police commanders, officers, and others, leadership, come before the community and answer a lot of these complaints. And so, we are being more community responsible today than ever before.
So I'm so glad that you're the chair of the local community board. That's real power on a local level. It's just amazing. Lurie, if police, and as Andre put it out there and Jerika put it out there, but not exactly user-friendly, and they've been now, and by the way, sometimes they are and sometimes they aren't, and we've all understand that. But now that they've been asked to handle issues such as mental health, such as homelessness and drug addiction, how do we navigate that, and how do we get to a place where this works? Because right now, as a lot of folks are saying, this is not working. How do we get to the place, to the other side of this?
I think the answer is in the question. We know that in the suburbs where you don't have an overburdensome presence of policing, but you do have an abundance of social services, that the outcomes are simply not the same. We know that my husband often tells the story of when he was in high school and there was a student there and her parents were boosters for the high school, and he was bused to a predominantly white school. He and his brothers played football, and they were bused from their predominantly black, their very black community into a predominantly white community in California. And he talks about the fact that when one of the students at the school whose parents were very involved in the school community, unfortunately, her parents died in a car crash, very tragically, very suddenly. The school brought in guidance counselors and support therapists and support staff to help all of the students in that school building to navigate and deal with the trauma of having had these beloved members of their community violently taken from them through a violent car crash, not the violence of a person who was intentionally acting to harm. And I compare that to I would need 4 more hands to count how many young people I know who have lost someone, who did not get a counselor, did not get therapy, but they do have a closet full of rest in peace t-shirts. And so when we think about the services that we are asking police to handle, they're not being asked to handle those services in every community. They're being asked to handle those services in communities from which the state has divested any actual engagement, any actual investment, any actual credible schooling, credible jobs, credible housing. When we know, when you look at communities that have abundance of job opportunities, that have affordable access to housing, that have quality education and healthcare, you do not see the same reliance on police to handle the issues that we rely on police to handle all throughout Black and brown communities throughout the city of New York. So I think that, one, we have to just recognize that when we invest in schools, when we invest in affordable housing, when we invest in all of these social services that communities are very clear that they need, we do not have the same need for police to be in communities and show up in the ways that they do. So I think that's the first thing. But I think the second thing is that there has to be a centering of what it means to, what a healthy community looks like, and what role we want police to play in it. So my co-panelist, Andre, community board president, just gave us a phenomenal outline of the ways in which he is able to tap into all of these spheres of influence that he has, be it the political, be it his work with ManUp, whatever the case may be. If we are able to invest equitably in communities and ensure that the basic needs of communities are being met, then it's a much easier lift to see how we rely far too much on police, and there are other opportunities that we could use and we could rely on instead. And I think the police would agree with that as well. They are not qualified to handle mental health issues. They are not qualified to handle domestic disputes. They are not qualified to handle a suicidal ideation moment. There are a whole host of issues that I 9 times out of 10 would rather have someone like Andre approach and address than I would the police. But when I live on a block like the block I live on in Bedford-Stuyvesant, what we are told is that there's no budget for a program like Andre's, while the New York City Police Department has a budget of over $6 billion. And what we see during the pandemic is that every single agency would take a haircut except policing, which means that we are creating intentionally through our budgets, these moral documents, we are intentionally creating the paradigms that require us to ask police to do things they are not able or capable of doing, have not been trained to do, because we are refusing to invest in those social services that actually are capable of handling the issues that we need them to handle. So I think if we were to center these skills and the expertise like ManUp, the violence interrupters, if we were to center the expertise that they bring to the table and fund them equitably. If you had $1 billion right now, Community Board President Mitchell, what would you and the ManUp group be able to do, not just for your catchment area, but for all the catchment areas that need you? And yet we're seeing that for every dollar that's going into NYPD services, education services are getting less than a third. Housing services are getting less than 25 cents. Workforce development, 12 cents on the dollar for every dollar that is going into the New York City Police Department. So if we were equitably funding these issues and the solutions that already exist, we're not talking about creating something out of thin air. They already exist. The question is, are we willing to put the money behind the solutions that we know are there? And we would do that if we were not talking about Black and Brown communities.
And then the question, of course, is, are we ready? So, Jerika, are we ready on a national level to take those levels, to take those steps? Are we ready with the proper policies put in place? Are we ready to ask our national leadership to take these needed steps to change how resources are allocated?
I think absolutely we are ready. The moment that we are in, the movement that we have seen, remember, all the folks that we were talking about on the national level and on the state and local, quite frankly, they are public servants. They are elected by the people. And in 2020, I mean, people protested on these issues and really focused on the points that Lurie raised before about how we allocate our resources. The public is saying that they need to be at the table, that our communities need to be empowered, and that it's important for the public to actually redefine what public safety is. And so if not for the taxpayers that are electing these officials and putting them into office, we are, as taxpayers, saying that this is a priority and this is how we want to spend our money. I think there is a lot of movement on the national level around redefining public safety, reimagining public safety, and really focusing on more community-centered solutions at the same time that we're advocating for some national standardization across the country. It shouldn't matter what color you are, what zip code you're in. Your experience and the outcome of an interaction with a police officer should be the same. Right now, that's just not the case. So I think we're moving in that direction. We're ready. I mean, there's been conversations about defund. I mean, you can call it by many different names, but I think we are in a place where we are ready to move forward and having the public define where we should allocate our money and what makes the most sense. And I'm concerned that if we don't take where we are now and continue to push to get some of these meaningful reforms and just the change in our whole thought process around what public safety means done, then we will miss our opportunity.
So I'm going to take that one step further, Jerika. Some people pointing to like the Camden model, where things have been allocated somewhat. Do you see that as a model that works or can be brought to other cities? Or are there other examples where some of that reallocation that you spoke about and Lurie spoke about needs to happen and maybe has happened a little bit so far?
Mm-hmm. So I don't know the ins and outs of the Camden model, but I will say I've spent my career and my time prior to coming to the National Urban League in police oversight and police accountability. I was at the CCRB. And so many of these conversations that we're having today have been happening in New York and in other places across the country. If you look at California, there are certain jurisdictions that are talking about exactly what Lurie pointed out. Who do we want to be our first responders? Where should we be putting our resources? And instead of putting resources into more officers and law enforcement, being those that are handling some of these traffic stops, they're really trying to move resources and allocate in that and put traffic stops and minor low-level infractions of offenses into the hands of civilians. I think that's one of the things that don't get lifted up enough. We have the opportunity, and New York is very unique. It has probably one of the largest and oldest civilian complaint review boards. And it is not perfect by any means, but over time, because of the community advocating for change and lifting up and saying we want there to be more accountability and more resources, we've seen changes. So I think when we talked about that bloated NYPD budget, there needs to be more conversation about the independent civilian investigators and prosecutors that are investigating these instances with law enforcement. I mean, they're unmatched. At the time before I left, the Civilian Complaint Review Board wasn't even 0.1% the budget of the NYPD. And so how can we put checks on our law enforcement officials and make sure that they are treating people in a fair and equitable and just way, if we are not allocating the resources in the way that they need to? And so there are many ideas that are out there. I'm actually going to drop the National Urban League last Monday. We released our 21 pillars for redefining public safety and restoring community trust. And really, we recognize that there needs to be a concerted effort on both the national, state, and local level, because we know all politics is local, and sometimes the changes and reforms that the community is able to push and advocate for on the local level may have an even more profound impact on someone's day-to-day life. So there are many models across the country that are popping up. They think that we all should be encouraged by. But I think at the core of all of them is centering these conversations, centering these solutions based on community and what the community wants to see.
So let me switch it right back to the community. I'm going to steal a question from Lurie that was pointed at Andre. Andre, I also sit on a community board. I'm not the chair, but I sit on a community board, 8 up in the Bronx. Let's say you got that extra millions or billion of dollars that or extra funding. Where would that go? What would that look like in East New York, in your community board?
Well, it would look like this is the much needed, desperated monies that we've been crying out for decades, actually hitting the ground. I mean, going directly to the community, which is where the need is most. And so, you will see a lot more people who are in need being serviced. I mean, so ideally, a lot of times when you see this funding coming down or coming through these agencies, it stops at a certain point. It doesn't hit the ground floor. It doesn't hit even below level. And so right now, our push has always been to advocate so that the money actually comes right down to the grassroots level where the need is most. And we are the best, and like has been mentioned, and I appreciate my co-panelists for speaking up for us, because we're the closest to the problem. So ironically, it's wiser that we'll be the ones that be able to have the best impact with the solutions. And so we've been able to demonstrate that. We now have evidence that speaks to us, a lot of data that has been produced and the evaluations that are out there that says just that, that this is a very cost-effective way of being able to, weed out crime, and stop it before it even a crime is committed, by addressing the needs of the people that need it most. And so if you've seen that extra money come in, and if it was directed and devoted to our communities, you can see it happening on a day-to-day level, and a lot of people would be being able to be serviced. So that's how we look.
You would get my vote. I want to tell you, Andre. I've been a real fan of the interrupter type of model. I work very closely with the 67 Precinct Clergy Council with Pastor Monrose. I sit on their advisory board, and were right there from the beginning, the folks in Neighbors in Action in Crown Heights. So what you guys do is just amazing. I want to talk a little bit. I've been asked a question, and it's on everyone's mind right now, is about hate crimes. And I know it's a little bit of a switch here, and we're going to dive back in, but how do you see hate crimes fitting into this issue that we've been talking about, the dehumanization, the systemic racism, the history that goes right back, as Lurie put it so poignantly? That's the only way I can describe it. Going back to the days of slavery in America, and as Jerika said, the Three-Fifths Compromise. How do you see hate crimes fitting into this whole piece here, and particularly now aimed at the Asian community in America? Anyone want to take that on?
Well, I would just offer that I think that what our Asian brothers and sisters are experiencing is really an outgrowth of the acceptability of othering people in this society. And it's always a challenge to have conversations like these, because there's so much history that has to be unpacked in order to fully inform the conversation. So for example, I have often advocated, and I'm just raising the point as loudly as I can, that when police officers, regardless of the race of the officer, are engaging in policing practices against Black and brown people that they would never use in white communities, that is a hate crime. Because but for the race of the person that you are policing, the race of the community that you are policing, and your understanding about their position of power in this society, you would be treating those Black and brown community members the same way you treat white people. But we don't preserve a space for hate crimes or use the designation of hate crimes in that regard, because these are police officers, and we know that there's immunity there. But the reality is that that is indeed a hate crime. And when we know that the FBI has, since the days, I believe the earliest report that I saw was in 2006, and I'm sure they go back farther than that, has been warning that the police precincts across the United States of America and the military forces in the United States of America are breeding grounds for white nationalism and white supremacist hate groups, because they provide training and they allow for the proliferation of these types of thoughts. Well, then when we're talking about hate crimes and we don't allow the term hate crime to be used in a way that incorporates racialized policing, then we're fundamentally missing the mark. As it pertains to what is happening with Asian Americans over the course of the year, we have seen an exponent, and I mean from like hundreds of reports of hate crimes against Asian Americans before 2020 to thousands of reports of hate crimes against Asians in 2020 or over the course of the past year. And when I'm interviewing people on my show, sometimes I'll have callers who will call in and say, well, hey, I just saw this video of a Black kid who punched an Asian elder in the face. What do you make of that? And it's always framed as sort of a gotcha question. And what I have to remind them is that, yes, you are going to see those types of videos highlighted because it fits the narrative. And it's a much more comfortable conversation for the majority of our society to say, look at this kid who's obviously in need of additional policing and how violent this kid is as against this Asian elder. And that begins to take on the parameters so much so that it sucks all of the air out of the room. And it diverts our attention from the fact that when we went from hundreds of hate crimes each year being committed as against Asian Americans to thousands, the vast majority of those hate crimes are being committed by white racist people. And so when we ask a question like that in a panel like this, it almost puts us in a position of not really dealing with the issue. And the issue as it pertains to hate crimes is that Asian Americans are being seen as the minority for the purposes of exhibiting racial bias in ways that in the past you might not have seen elevated as quite as much. And we know that there was a lot of politicization over the course of the last administration. We know that they were intentionally highlighted with extremely disparaging terminology related to the pandemic. And so there was a racialization of even how we incorporate our understanding of public health and who might be responsible versus who is not. And so I think what we have to realize is that we have had decades, really since the 60s and 70s, of having this idea that Asian Americans were a part of this minority who had escaped the burdens and the victimization of racism in this society. And what we're seeing is that that is actually not true. And that now that our Asian American brothers and sisters are also voting in mass And now that they are also engaging civically in mass and in greater and greater numbers and being much more outspoken about their existence in the society, they are helping to complicate what many would prefer a more simple version of, and that is the story of their existence in this society, one that has at times given them closer approximation to whiteness, one that itself has within its own ranks a lot of anti-Blackness, and there have been histories of tensions between Black and Asian communities. We've seen videos just in Crown Heights. I think a couple of years ago, we saw the Black women who were being beat up in that store. So we know that there is this history there. And so when I respond to a question like that, I have to give that history so that we understand the breadth of the problem, because a lot of times what we will see is a hyper focusing on one particular incident without looking at the systemization of norming what it means to other someone, and seeing that happen time after time again, and wanting to find easy and neat ways of dismissing the concerns that it raises. And I think that it's better for us to sit in the very complicated space of that intersection that looks at all of those issues and then asks the question, what are we going to do about the bias that people of color, everyone who is non-white in this society, has to endure in order to just have basic access to the rights that others are able to take for granted?
Thank you. So I'm gonna, we have just another 7 minutes or so I'm gonna steal your question again, Lurie. Obviously, you're good at doing the moderation yourself. I know that you have a great show, and I've watched it a number of times. What do we do? Where do we go? And I just want to put a subject out there too that I'd love for you to talk about. This is the New York Jewish Coalition on Criminal Justice Reform. Now, the New York Jewish community is not anything but monolithic. Anything but monolithic. We have all different kinds of folks. There are Jews of color. There are Jews from Arab lands. There are Jews from all across the world. But the majority are of Eastern European background. Allyship. What does that look like? And where do we go? And how do we get to where we need to be? And we're going to sort of use that as the closing question. It's just, it's something I think everyone who's on board really wants to hear. So if we can start with Jerika.
I think it's a really important question. And I will just say, just to pick up on where Lurie left off, is the other underpinning when we're talking about the rhetoric and the politicalization that we saw impacting the Asian community and really bringing a light to hate crimes in that areas, is the fact that there is in this country, and also unfortunately in this world, an issue of scapegoating that happens with people of color, but is quite frankly has also happened with the Jewish community. I think when we're talking about where we go from here, the answer is in the name, coalition. Coalition building is what we really need to do right now. I mean, we've seen the rise of violent extremism. We've seen domestic terrorism on many different fronts against many different communities. It's really time that we work very strategically together and recognize that all these issues surrounding justice and equity and dehumanization are impacting multiple communities. And it's in our effort in working together to actually focus on these issues and address these issues that are happening in multiple communities that I think we can carve a path forward. So it's all about coalition building and being able to see the challenges that I might be experiencing in my community, to be able to understand similar challenges that someone else in another community is also facing. And so having conversations like these, but also working together to advocate for really meaningful policy changes and reforms to make sure that we are centering racial equity and diversity and opportunity in all of our policy making decisions and conversations are just critical. So coalition building, I can't say it enough. that's where we need to be moving right now. And I'm glad that we're having this conversation, because in my mind's eye, the criminal justice system and reforming it is our new civil rights movement today. And it's a movement that I know the Jewish community had been heavily involved in, and I know the African American community and others and faith leaders across the country had been involved with, and it's where we need to go today.
So, Lurie, you and I met during a coalition on the census. God, if we only counted 89 more people, oh Lord, I cannot believe it. Boy, you can't ask for a do-over. In Brooklyn, we always ask for a do-over. But how would you see this allyship, this partnership blossoming so that we can get to where we need to be as a nation?
So I think that, and I would co-sign everything that Jerika just said, and I think it was extremely well said. I think I would add to that, that the most successful coalitions that deal with these issues from an interracial perspective are those where each of the groups represented in that coalition are actively engaging in the process of self-evaluation. So what does that mean? It means that for my white brothers and sisters, I need them to love justice so much and to love humanity so much that they're willing to do the very hard work of recognizing what white supremacy is, recognizing that they have embraced a number of the benefits and privileges of it, and love humanity enough to heal from it and see it as a sickness that they must address. Because even in coalition, if you are going to bring the same privileges and social hierarchy positioning that you occupy into the coalition space, then it really becomes a coalition that is reflective of all of the ills in society that hopefully the coalition is seeking to address. And so I would hope that for coalitions really to be effective, we would recognize that we don't just need allies, we need anti-racist accomplices. And that is really complicated because I have a certain level of privilege within the African-American community, for example. I am a Black woman of lighter brown skin privilege, which means that I'm going to have access, typically, not always, but typically I'm going to have more consideration and more opportunities than are people who are darker brown in complexion than I am. So what does that mean for me? That means in my mind, in my view of the world, I need to be interrogating what that means. And I need to be using my privilege in as many ways as possible to open up doors for the people in my community who are not going to show up in a body that is going to be received the way mine might. And so I need white brothers and sisters, regardless of religion, but those who are faith-based, I especially hope that they can see this, to recognize that white supremacy is, I will use the Christian tradition, a demonic spirit, right? That needs to be cast out. And however, whatever the analog for demonic spirit is in the Jewish faith, Rabbi, I will trust that you will be able to make the translation. But we need to call these things what they are, and then do the very difficult work of healing from it, recognizing that it is a lifetime's worth of work. And that if we are going to be effective at building coalition, that is the work that must be brought to bear. So it's not even enough to be an ally. If one is not anti-racist and seeking to proactively dismantle racism, call it out in the very uncomfortable spaces as loudly as we do in the comfortable spaces, then I think our future together is a limited one. But I believe in a God who happens to be unlimited. And so I am confident and optimistic that if we embrace this work well, that we too can cast out the demons of white supremacy in a way that is going to allow us to actually have a shot at creating an equitable world.
You know, when scripture says justice, justice, ye shall pursue, the question has always been asked, why? Why twice? Well, the first time is for us to take a look at society for overall, and then to go inside. Then to go inside who you are, and to know that you believe in justice and you believe in the dignity of all as a God-given right. So, Andre, I'm going to end with you because you are the community. You represent where the rubber meets the road, where everything happens. And I'm a community organizer. I'm proud of it. What does this look like, and what does dignity mean to you in your community?
Well, let me just say in closing, it has just been a tremendous pleasure to sit in and just listen and learn from these two brilliant minds that we have, alongside me in this panel. I'm so honored and thankful because, I mean, it just it just helps lift us up and gets us to where we need to be in relations to what is our next steps, right? And so, as I said earlier, it really, all of what we propose really wouldn't really make, it really wouldn't be any good if it doesn't make its way all the way to the ground, right? And make sure that what we want to see happen on a societal level is happening on a grassroots level. And that coalition building, the efforts of that, the impacts of that, the results of that is something that we can honestly say on the ground that it's working. And so I think that with good people like ourselves who constantly are willing to come together in these sort of forums and put our minds together, I think that there is a chance out there. I'm an optimist. And so I believe that things will get better in time. And so I just think that people just have to I think people have to just continue to bond and to open themselves up, because I think that what we're up against is a monster. I think racism is a disease, and that if it continues to spread and white supremacy continues to do what it does, no one of us is going to be exempt, and so it will even devour its very own. But at the end of the day, I think that when we really want, we should want for everybody that we want for ourselves, especially those that are less fortunate. And so on this note and on this level where I am on a daily basis, I'm proud to be out here and serving out here. I'm just looking forward to the Calvary coming together like we did tonight. So thank you for having me.
So I'm being a person of faith as well. I want to thank our common creator for allowing me to be with you tonight, for allowing us to get together and do this work and continue marching forward. It is so radically important. I want to thank all of our presenters tonight, Jerika and Lurie and Andre. Just amazing. It's just amazing. And yes, we need to build those coalitions, and we need to bring it on a national level, and we need to bring it right down into the streets of East New York. It needs to happen on all levels. We need to change society. And it may be hard, maybe really hard, but we're going to do it. And we're going to do it together as Americans, notwithstanding all the stuff that has happened in the past. We have to make the present and the future what we need it to be and where we need it to be. So I want to thank you all. I want to thank everyone who was with us tonight. Got a couple of commercial announcements to make. The coalition, the Jewish Coalition, New York Jewish Coalition on Criminal Justice Reform, it's a mouthful, by the way, is going to be pulling together a Manhattan DA's forum, and all that will be in the chat. I want to thank Rachel Kleinbaum, the director of the coalition, and Abby Tiger, the chair of the education committee, for helping to put this together and giving me great questions, by the way, to ask. And it's really, really good stuff. I got a great script. There's also going to be a concert coming out of Ramamu. We're really excited about that. And if anyone is interested in finding out more about the coalition, I'm sure Rachel will put that information in the chat as well, how you can find out more. And so this work that we need to do, this work that we are obligated to do, this work that is necessary to do, can continue moving forward. So we can spend our evenings doing more important things with our families and the people we love than having to talk about just fixing society. So I really thank you so much. I can't begin to even express the wisdom that was part of tonight. And again, thank you, and good night, everybody.
That was awesome.
It's only the three of us. We're good.
Man, Lurie is just incredible.
I love her.
It actually isn't just the three of us. More people are signing off. Hang on.
No, I think there's only three people.
People can see us? Can people see us? Okay.
Bye, everyone.